The widow's shawl. The rain came down in sheets that October evening, turning the dusty streets of Millbrook into rivers of mud and regret. Samuel Hayes pulled his worn coat tighter around his shoulders as he guided his wagon through the downpour, the wheels creaking a familiar tune that had been his only companion these past 3 years. He'd come to town for supplies, flour, salt, and a new harness for old Bessie, but the storm had caught him just as he'd finished loading his purchases. Most folks had the good sense to stay indoors on a night like this, but Samuel had never been one to let weather dictate his movement. The farm wouldn't tend itself, and there was always work waiting, rain or shine. As he rounded the corner past the general store, movement in the alley caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be a stray dog seeking shelter, but as lightning split the sky, he saw her clearly, a young woman huddled against the brick wall, her thin dress soaked through, dark hair plastered to her skull like wet ink. Samuel pulled hard on the reins, bringing the wagon to a stop. The woman looked up at the sound of hooves splashing through puddles, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Even in the dim light, he could see she was shivering uncontrollably. "Miss," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the storm. "You all right there?" She struggled to her feet, pressing herself back against the wall as if trying to disappear into the bricks themselves. "I'm fine, mister," she called back, though her chattering teeth betrayed her words. "Just who's taking shelter?" Samuel studied her for a long moment. She was young, couldn't be more than 25, with a face that might have been pretty if it weren't so gaunt and her dress, once perhaps a cheerful blue, was now a muddy gray, and he could see her bare feet through the holes in what remained of her shoes. "This ain't no place to be taking shelter," he said, climbing down from the wagon. "You'll catch your death out here." The woman's eyes darted left and right, as if looking for an escape route. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audibly above the rain. "Lost my job at the boarding house last week. Been staying wherever I can find a dry spot." Samuel's heart clenched. The sight of her reminded him painfully of another woman, another time when he'd failed to provide shelter when it was needed most. Without thinking, he reached into the back of his wagon and pulled out a carefully folded piece of fabric, a wool shawl, the color of autumn leaves, embroidered with tiny yellow flowers. Mary's shawl. His hands trembled as he held it, memories flooding back like the rain pouring down around them. Mary had worn this shawl on their wedding day, claiming it brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes. She'd wrapped it around their daughter during cold winter nights, singing lullabies that seemed to make the very walls of their cabin warm. It was the last thing she'd worn before the fever took her, along with little Emily, leaving Samuel alone in a world that suddenly seemed too big and too empty. He'd kept the shawl folded in tissue paper for 3 years, unable to look at it but unable to part with it either. But now, seeing this stranger shivering in the rain, something inside him broke open. "Here," he said, stepping toward her with the shawl outstretched. "This'll help keep you warm." The woman stared at the offered garment as if it were made of gold. "I can't take that, mister. Looks like something special." "It is special," Samuel said quietly, wrapping the shawl around her shoulders despite her protests. "That's why it should be used for something good." The moment the wool touched her skin, the woman's entire posture changed. She pulled the shawl tight around herself, and for the first time since he'd spotted her, she stopped shivering. The rich brown color made her pale skin look less ghostly, and Samuel found himself wondering what she might look like with a decent meal in her belly and clean clothes on her back. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears that mixed with the rain on her cheeks. My name's Catherine Miller, Samuel Hayes," he replied, tipping his hat. "And Miss Miller, I got a proposition for you." Catherine's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Living on the streets, it obviously taught her to be wary of propositions from strangers, especially men. Samuel held up his hands. "Nothing improper, miss. I just got a farm about 5 miles outside town. Wheat and corn mostly. Some chickens and a milk cow. Place is too big for one man, and I could use help with the cooking and cleaning. In exchange, you'd have a roof over your head, 3 meals a day, and a small wage besides. Why? Catherine asked bluntly. Why would you help a stranger? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain cascade off the brim of his hat. Because I know what it's like to lose everything, he said finally. And because he gestured toward the shawl. Because she would have wanted me to. Catherine's fingers traced the delicate embroidery on the shawl's edge. Your wife's was, along with my daughter. Faber took them both 3 years back. The words came easier than they had in a long time, perhaps because he was speaking to someone who understood loss in her own way. I'm sorry, Catherine said softly. I lost my husband to a mining accident 2 years ago. That's how I ended up here, had to sell everything just to pay his debts. They stood there in the rain, two broken souls, bound by grief and circumstance, until Samuel cleared his throat. So what do you say, Miss Miller? Care to give an old farmer a chance to do something decent for once? Catherine looked down at the shawl, then back up at Samuel's weathered face. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. I'd be grateful for the work, Mr. Hay, but he should warn you, I'm not much of a cook. Samuel actually smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. Well, miss, you can't be worse than me. I've been eating nothing but beans and hardtack for 3 years. Anything's got to be an improvement. The ride to the farm passed mostly in comfortable silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of rain on the wagon's canvas cover, and the occasional comment about the weather or the countryside. Catherine sat wrapped in Mary's shawl, her posture gradually relaxing as the warmth seeped into her bones. Samuel found himself stealing glances at her profile, surprised by the stirring of something he'd thought dead and buried with his family. Not attraction, not yet, but a sense of possibility. For the first time in 3 years, his farmhouse wouldn't be empty when he walked through the door. The Hayes farm sat in a small valley surrounded by rolling hills, the wheat fields stretching out like a golden sea, even in the rain. The house itself was modest but well built, with a wide front porch and green shutters that had seen better days. Catherine could see that it had once been a home filled with love and laughter, though now it felt somehow hollow, like a shell waiting to be filled again. It's beautiful, she said as Samuel helped her down from the wagon, and she meant it. After weeks of sleeping in alleys and abandoned buildings, the simple farmhouse looked like a palace. Mary always said it looked like something from a fairy tale, Samuel replied, then caught himself. He hadn't spoken his wife's name aloud in months. Come on, let's get you inside and dried off. I'll show you to your room. The interior of the house was clean but Spartan, as if all the warmth and personality had been carefully packed away. Family photographs had been torn face down on the mantel, and Catherine could see the outline of where other pictures had once hung on the walls. This was Emily's room, Samuel said, opening the door to a small bedroom off the main hallway. The room was empty except for a simple bed and dresser. But Catherine could see the faint outline on the wall where children's drawings had once been displayed. How old was she? Catherine asked gently. 6, would have been 9 this Christmas. Samuel's voice was steady, but Catherine saw his hands clench at his sides. There's linens in the dresser, and Mary's, there's some clothes in the wardrobe that might fit you. Feel free to use whatever you need. After Samuel left her alone, Catherine sat on the edge of the bed and really looked at the room for the first time. This had been a child's sanctuary, she realized, a place of safety and love. The thought made her throat tight with unshed tears. She carefully removed Mary's shawl and folded it, setting it on the dresser like a sacred relic. Then she opened the wardrobe and found herself face to face with the ghost of another woman's life. The dresses were simple but well made, in colors that spoke of someone who hadn't let hardship kill her joy. Sunny yellow, soft blue, warm brown, like rich earth. Catherine selected a brown wool dress that looked like it might fit and held it up to herself in the mirror. For the first time in months, she caught a glimpse of the woman she used to be, before hunger and desperation had carved hollows in her cheeks and dulled the light in her eyes. Downstairs, she found Samuel in the kitchen, staring into the fire he'd built in the old iron stove. He'd changed into dry clothes and combed his graying hair, and Catherine realized he was probably only in his early 40s, though grief had aged him beyond his years. "The dress fits," she said quietly, smoothing the brown wool over her hips. "Are you sure it's all right for me to wear it?" Samuel turned to look at her, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, recognition, perhaps a touch of pain. "She would have wanted them to be worn," he said simply. "No point in letting good clothes go to waste." That first night, Catherine made a simple supper of eggs and fried potatoes, while Samuel tended to the animals. It wasn't much, but it was more substantial than anything either of them had eaten in recent memory. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, making awkward conversation about the weather and the farm work that needed doing. "What was she like?" Catherine asked, suddenly, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "No, it's all right," Samuel said, pushing food around on his plate. Mary was the kind of person who made everything seem possible, could take a handful of wildflowers and make them look like something from a fancy garden. As the patience of Job with Emily, even when she was going through her difficult phase, he smiled faintly at the memory. Used to sing while she worked, had a voice like an angel. "She sounds wonderful," Catherine said sincerely. She was. They both were. Samuel was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Catherine with something like wonder in his eyes. "I haven't talked about them like this in 3 years. Funny how it gets easier when there's someone to listen." As the days turned into weeks, a routine developed between them. Samuel would rise before dawn to tend the animals and work the fields, while Catherine managed the house, cooking, cleaning, mending clothes that had been ignored for too long. In the evenings, they would sit the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the companionable silence. Slowly, the house began to come alive again. Catherine found the family photographs Samuel had hidden away and gently suggested putting them back on display. She repaired curtains that had been torn and neglected and filled the rooms with the scent of bread baking and stew simmering. "You don't have to do all this," Samuel protested one evening as he watched her carefully arranging wildflowers in a mason jar. "I just hired you to help with the basics." "It's no trouble," Catherine replied, adjusting a stem. "Besides, a house should feel like a home." Mary would have wanted that. Samuel stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "How do you know what Mary would have wanted?" Catherine paused in her work, considering the question seriously. "Because any woman who could make that shawl, who could raise a child in a house this full of love, she wouldn't want it to stay empty forever. She'd want it to be a place of life again." That night, for the first time since his family died, Samuel didn't dream of coffins and fevered faces. Instead, he dreamed of laughter echoing through his house again. The turning point came on a crisp November morning when Catherine found Samuel standing in Emily's room, holding a small wooden doll with young hair and button eyes. "I made this for her last Christmas," he said, without looking up. "Took me weeks to get the face right. Mary always said I had clumsy hands, but I wanted to make something special for my little girl." Catherine approached slowly, as if she were trying not to spook a wild animal. "It's beautiful. She must have loved it." "She did. Took it everywhere with her. Even to—" Samuel's voice broke, and he sank down onto the small bed, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Without thinking, Catherine sat beside him and gently took his hand. "It's all right," she said softly. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." And something inside Samuel Hayes finally broke open completely. He wept then as he hadn't allowed himself to weep in 3 years, for his wife's gentle hands, for his daughter's giggling laugh, for all the conversations he'd never have, and the birthdays he'd never celebrate. Catherine held his hand through all of it, offering no empty platitudes, just the quiet strength of someone who understood grief from the inside. When the storm finally passed, Samuel looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't know how to stop missing them," he admitted. "You don't," Catherine said simply. "You just learn to carry the love along with the loss. And maybe you find room for new love too, if you're brave enough to try." Their eyes met and held, and Samuel realized that somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing Mary when he looked at Catherine. She was her own person, strong where Mary had been gentle, practical where Mary had been dreamy, resilient in ways that only someone who had lost everything could be. "Catherine," he said quietly, still holding her hand. "Yes? Would you? That is, I know this is sudden, and I understand if you need time to think about it, but..." He took a deep breath. "Would you consider staying, not just as hired help, but as family?" Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. "Are you asking me to marry you, Samuel Hayes?" "I reckon I am. I know it's not the romantic proposal a woman dreams of, and I can't promise I won't still have bad days when the grief gets too heavy, but I can promise you'll never be cold or hungry or alone again. And I think maybe we could build something good together, something Mary and Emily would have approved of." Catherine was quiet for so long that Samuel began to think he'd made a terrible mistake. Then she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since that night in the rain. "I think I'd like that very much," she said. "But on one condition, name it. I want to wear her shawl for the wedding, if that's all right with you." Samuel's throat constricted with emotion. He thinks he'd be honored. They were married on a Sunday in December, in the little white church in Millbrook. Catherine wore Mary's shawl over a new dress, palely green wool that brought out the color in her eyes, and Samuel wore his best suit with a wildflower boutonniere. The ceremony was simply witnessed by a handful of neighbors who had watched Samuel Hayes grieve for 3 years and were overjoyed to see him smile again. As they stood at the altar, promising to love and honor each other through whatever hardships life might bring, Catherine felt the weight of the shawl around her shoulders like a blessing. She wasn't trying to replace Mary. No one could do that. But she could help Samuel build a new kind of happiness, one that honored the past while embracing the future. After the ceremony, as they drove home through the snow-dusted fields, Samuel reached over and took her hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what? For giving me back my life. For making my house a home again. For wearing her shawl like it was made for you." Catherine squeezed his hand. "Thank you for covering a stranger in the rain. For seeing someone worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." That night, as they sat by the fire as husband and wife, Catherine carefully folded Mary's shawl and placed it in the cedar chest at the foot of their bed. It would be there when they needed it, for cold winter nights, for special occasions, for moments when they wanted to remember that love could bloom again, even in the ashes of loss. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the farm in a blanket of white. But inside the Hayes farmhouse, warmth and laughter filled the rooms once more, and two lonely souls had found their way home at last. Years later, when their own children asked about the beautiful embroidered shawl in the cedar chest, Catherine would tell them the story of how their father saved her life with a simple act of kindness. And Samuel would add that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the love you learned from losing someone else. The shawl became a family heirloom, passed down through generations, carrying with it the story of compassion triumphing over despair, of two broken hearts learning to beat as one. And every time it was worn, it carried the memory of a rainy October night when a widowed farmer saw a stranger in need and chose to share the most precious thing he had left, not just his dead wife's shawl, but his capacity to love again. In the end, that's what Mary would have wanted most of all.